with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Celia J. Falicov, who is a renowned family therapist, author, and teacher, respected for her expertise on cultural diversity and commitment to social justice and racial equity. She is the past director of mental health services of the student-run Free Clinics Project, Department of Family Medicine, University of California, San Diego, where she developed a program of volunteer professionals in response to the needs of under-resourced immigrants. Dr. Falicov has authored a number of books, which include Cultural Perspectives in Family Therapy, Family Transitions, Continuity and Change Over the Life Cycle, and the widely praised Latino Families in Therapy. And she has also co-authored the 2014 APA book, Multiculturalism and Diversity in Clinical Supervision. And with that, I am so delighted. I have watched Dr. Falicov throughout my career and have admired and seen her as a role model for those of us who came after. And so I am very honored and privileged to present to you tonight, Dr. Celia Falicov. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marlene, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you tonight. As you've seen, the title of my talk is Family Therapy as a Complex Cultural and Sociopolitical Encounter. I was planning to ask, when does the encounter begin? And you will see that I will do that between practitioners and clients. But I realized that actually the cultural encounter and sociopolitical encounter between me and you, the audience, has just begun. This encounter creates a space of learning for you, and I hope I learned from it too, because teaching and learning are reciprocal acts, like Paulo Freire told us a long time ago. So, for example, the topics of cultural diversity and sociopolitical justice have new terminologies, and I do not know if I'm completely up to date with them. So then I would be most appreciative if you're in the chat or in the question and answers, you correct me if I make any mistakes. So it also would be great for you if you could start writing on your notes anything that is not clear that you want me to clarify during the last half hour when we're going to meet after the presentation for questions and answers. So let me start with sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, I'm just having a little bit of difficulty with this now.
We can see your screen now.
And yes, except that I cannot. So let me see if I. All right, now I can. All right, so I am. Can you all see me? All right, can you all see the screen?
Yes.
All right, okay. So let's make sure that the terminology that I'm using is something that we share. When I talk about cultural, I mean diversity, and that means diversity in values, belief systems, such as collectivism, individualism. When I talk about sociopolitical, I mean inequality. Political always has the power axis going through it. So it is equivalent to talking about social justice, about power and privilege. Sometimes I will use culture and context as a summary of both, or sometimes I use sociocultural. So, and then let's talk about what is an encounter. Well, an encounter is visits or sessions where dialogues take place between a client and a practitioner. That's why we call it relational, because it's always a dialogue. And they're initiated by the client for the purpose of obtaining help. So when do issues of culture and context really start? Well, I believe they really start in the first minutes of encounter, when names are exchanged. Can you guess what my name says about my culture and social location? You may be confused by what now is my middle name, but it was my given last name when I was born that became my middle name. So you could start making guesses as to why I haven't kept that as my last name, and I acquired the name of my husband. And we could discuss that a great deal. That's not my intention today. I just want to make sure that I communicate that we immediately make some guesses and judgments about people in accordance to their names. You probably might guess that I am an Argentine Jew, Argentina being the country in South America with the largest number of people with a Spanish first name and a Jewish last name. I doubt that my clients would necessarily know this, but they will know that I'm unlikely to be Anglo-American, that they might see me in ethnic terms or as an immigrant who speaks English pretty well, but not as a native born. So now let me add to my name my highest educational degree, a doctorate, which indicates a sociopolitical position of higher education, authority, influence, status, even power, which may be intimidating, but it also carries responsibility, accountability, and expertise, which may be reassuring that I can help. Or it may be something that calls people attention. So we can say that a name embodies a cultural and a sociopolitical narrative, that when you look at your own name, what does it evoke in terms of your origins? Is it mainstream? Is it ethnic? Is it foreign? What do you think your clients think when they see your name and your title? What do you think of their name? Is it a mainstream name, a Latinx name, an Asian name, a Black name? And do you consider what your clients think you're going to think about them, particularly if their names are not mainstream? So we could ask, who has double consciousness? Who looks at oneself through the eyes of others in the relational encounter? I'm going to say that our clients know that we as practitioners have a cultural and sociopolitical location even before we do, starting with our names, our degrees, how we dress, how our consulting work looks. They also know that how we may be perceiving them in particular ways. So it's important to think, do we as practitioners have this double consciousness? Something that the African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, in his crucial book, The Souls of Black Folk, told us a long time ago, explaining that African Americans know who they are internally, but they also imagine internally how they are perceived by others, mostly in prejudicial ways. And there is research that confirms that subordinated groups in society, such as people of color or immigrants, are more keenly aware of how they are seen by more powerful or privileged others. So names are doors at the intersection between the outside and the inside of people's lives. Names, like culture and context, are public and private. We do not know their meaning until we ask. Meanings are not known in advance or fixed. A name can mean different things at the public level than the private one. So we must always ask, not assume. This actually applies to everything I will say today. Ask, do not assume. But it is useful to think in some general terms about double consciousness, about how you as a therapist may be perceived by clients in terms of cultural consonance or dissonance, or in terms of your levels of power and privilege. So I believe that this looking at yourself through the eyes of the other is learning about the relational aspect of culture from the go. So for instance, immigrants from collectivistic cultures often say that they worry that Anglo-American therapists have a different mentality about, for instance, adolescent freedoms. And they worry that because the immigrants are from a different culture and we are more powerful, therapists might impose their way of thinking on their adolescents. So let me illustrate both A and B, cultural dissonance and levels of power, or levels of inequality in an encounter that had a staggering effect on me. It is an old example, but one that I continue to think about because maybe because it was traumatic, but also because the learnings were so important. It was an encounter with a Latinx immigrant family in a hospital setting. It's the case of Ricky and his Puerto Rican great aunt. As a bilingual clinical psychologist, I was called to a hospital where a 7-year-old Puerto Rican boy, Ricky, had recently been operated for congenital heart disease. His great aunt, an elderly woman of color, was next to him praying, clutching a rosary. The nurses and doctors blamed her, having actually come to dislike her, for slowing down the child's recovery. They said she pampered him too much, she brought greasy food instead of healthy hospital food, that she was fatalistic by praying and holding on to her rosary, and that she did not activate the boy physically by walking him up and down the corridors. A consulting psychiatrist had already been called to the scene, and he had written in the chart that her overprotection towards the boy may be an unconscious reaction formation, a very technical psychoanalytic term, that meant that she must have felt resentful at having to take care of a child at her late age. So these are the people involved: the hospital staff, which was quite large, the psychologist, myself, who was called as a translator and as conveyor of their message primarily. They wanted me to tell the great aunt that what they thought she was doing wrong. And then Ricky and Socorro, the great aunt. So this was an encounter with diverse cultures and sociopolitical locations that need to be understood and compared. So let's do that. How do we compare cultural diversity in dealing with a sick child? Well, the great aunt values were praying for his recovery, feeding him, protecting him from any effort, while the hospital's culture was to give him healthy food and make him move, and don't pray in front of him because you're going to make him sad or depressed. So the alienation between the hospital staff and the great aunt was no doubt due to different models of family life, different models of what parenting is, and age-appropriate expectations in dealing with a sick child. I actually tried to think compassionately about all sides. Nobody was really a villain. A child was dying. That's a universal human tragedy. Everybody was using the concepts learned in their personal and their professional cultures to cope. By and large, doctors work tremendously hard and care about their patients. And they care a lot about their children patients. But by a power dynamic based on race, class, gender, and immigrant status, render the great aunt powerless to ask for a second medical opinion, like a white middle-class mother would have felt emboldened to do, let alone, complain about being blamed. And so there was absolutely no equity in this situation. She was a woman of color, powerless to complain, confronted with a white privilege that made doctors entitled to diagnose a human situation by blaming a human being that loved the child, by blaming the great aunt for the lack of physical progress in the child. Sometimes diagnosis is blaming, sometimes blaming the victim of oppression. This case happened some time ago, long time ago. Do you think it could happen today? So maybe in the chat, you could say, yes, it can happen. No, it cannot happen. Or you can say, if I asked you, how we make progress from this type of cultural and social injustice. So then you can put in the chat, yes, we have made progress. No, we have made no progress or little progress. I will come back to this case because there's one missing piece, and that's me as the psychologist called to the scene. This experience really taught me deeply that the clinical encounter is not culturally or sociopolitically neutral. It's not equal, it's not neutral. So the family brings their maps, and so does the practitioner in terms of their theory, their training, and their lived experiences. it is for several decades now, there has been a preoccupation in many fields, not just family therapy, on how to treat clients from other cultural backgrounds. And many people have received cultural competence training focused primarily on ethnic information about different cultural groups, about values, customs, rituals, beliefs about illness. And of different groups, Africans, African Americans, Latin Americans, Russians, Vietnamese. And it certainly raises awareness that one size does not fit all, and a more open attitude towards other cultures. But these generalizations have limitations in that we may perpetuate stereotypes because ethnic values are not static, they're in constant flux. The identities are multidimensional, they're contextuals. There isn't a typical Arab client or the Asian family or the African asylum seeker or the Puerto Rican family. They just do not exist. There's too much variability that cannot be reduced to a list of traits. And what I mean by othering there is that by just looking at these fixed categories or traits, who do we compare it with? Well, we compare it with whiteness and mainstream values and beliefs as the norms. And so we know that cultural competence actually needs to address the impact of inequalities in the lives of clients and their right to have their own cultures, and the practitioner as having a non-neutral and a powerful cultural and social position. So then we have a big challenge now. Given that there is cultural diversity and sociopolitical power differences in the therapy encounter, how do we promote an environment where we can say safety comes first, that cultural awareness and cultural relational safety is important for everybody involved? Well, a solution that I have proposed is an approach or framework that I have been working for several years, or many years, which is called Mecca. And Mecca stands for multidimensional ecological comparative approach. And if we go a little bit further in understanding what the meanings of these four categories are, that multidimensional means multiple identities, ecological means social context, comparative means that Mecca uses the same dimensions to compare clients and practitioners rather than many different dimensions. And that it's also a framework to integrate culture and context in training and in practice. It is not a school of therapy, which means then it can be used with any school of therapy that you adhere to. What do I mean by multidimensional and ecological? Well, I mean a thick description of multiple cultural identities and social locations, both for the family and for the therapist. Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, told us a long time ago to use thick descriptions when it comes to cultures. And I believe that actually each one of us, therapists, do already do this. We do not see clients in this flat way with just one label. We understand that clients are a mosaic of identities and locations. I'm sure that we all have these dimensions and locations in our minds that when we see our clients without having to spell them out. So we all think in terms of what I call an ecological image. But but the issue then it becomes how to interpret this, how to move it into the clinical situation. And Mecca takes into account multiple identities and sociopolitical locations. And we all have much more than one identity. We know that we have multiple identities. And so it can become a framework for mapping multicultural identities, as most of us have. So let's go back for a minute to Ricky's case and ask, what made it possible for me to become a sort of sociocultural bridge in a complex system of several cultures, the patient, the family, the pediatric cardiologist, the nurses, the psychiatrist? Well, let's look at my own cultural and sociopolitical experiences that at the relational level become cultural borderlines with others. So these are my multiple identities. And if we look at my ecological niche in relation to Ricky's family, the orange are areas of similarities, my cultural borderlands with a great aunt. There were gender, language, immigration experience, parenthood. The areas in yellow are the differences in socioeconomic status, education, religion. She's about Catholic. But differences in yellow are precisely what allowed me to stand in between. I could share borders with the medical system. My husband was a physician. I'm white. I'm bilingual professional with a doctor. And so there are areas of context that created cultural awareness and sensitivity with a great aunt. But my sociopolitical status gave me the power to speak up and to advocate for them. So I think today's cultural competence is embracing two helpful concepts. So I'm going to speak a little bit about them. One is cultural humility, and the other one is intersectionality. So cultural humility refers to the practitioner being aware about their culture, race, class, and also aware of power dynamics. And at the same time, allow clients to be the experts on their culture and their context. So let me give you a little anecdote that I think could illustrate cultural humility. Some years ago, I had to do a presentation in Zurich, Switzerland, and I came across a flower shop that had lilies of the valley in the window. And I was inspired, and I bought 3 little pots for the presentation. In one, I kept the plant in its pot. In the second one, I uprooted the plant with some soil around the roots, because I knew that that would facilitate, any good gardener would know that, the success of the transplantation. And then research shows us that that's the case with them too. And like the flowers that I cut off from the roots. A pastoral counselor was in the audience, and afterwards asked me if he could borrow the metaphor for his next Sunday sermon. He had always thought that the faster immigrants assimilated, the better off they would be. And he had used the power of the pulpit to spread this idea. Now he humbly realized that he could not impose his own cultural preference, that the issue of culture change had to be part of a dialogue with immigrant families about their decision about what to keep and what to let go. It was a huge insight, one that Ricky's doctors did not have. We have also been in our current discourses about culture and power, we have been using the idea of colonization. What does colonization mean? Well, it means when the professional imposes a dominant concept or a clinical practice as normal and therefore right, without awareness that it's not universal. And that gives them the power to define meaning and to intervene, like the psychiatrist in Ricky's case, or the Swiss pastor before he became enlightened. So their power granted them privilege, the privilege of having one version of the truth to believe. The second concept that has entered clinical practice is intersectionality. Well, similar to ecological niche, intersectionality speaks about the multiplicity of identities and how they intersect to compound systems of privilege and oppression. As we saw in ecological niche, identities are multiple. Intersectionality speaks more directly about how they intersect to create systems of oppression. These oppressions are important because they influence health and mental health. But I find it also important to reflect on the fact that intersectionality is not an individual or an internal trait. Sometimes I actually worry about that if we're not careful, intersectionality can be seen in the same frozen fixed lens of individual ethnic specificity. While I think that actually intersectionality manifests itself in the encounter, it is about how we react when we see the combination of a foreign name, a dark face, an immigrant man, and how the health system, the school, or the police deal with it, or how we as therapists deal with it. So intersectionality happens in an intercultural, in a space. So cultural humility and intersectionality are hard to apply in the abstract, and many clients may not even be aware of the impact of diversity and inequality in their anguish and their suffering. One author that I have read some about is David Foster Wallace. And I'm going to read from the slide because it's something he wrote and I want to respect. So he wrote, he gave a wonderful commencement speech in 2005 at Kenyon College and said, there are these two young fish swimming along and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. He says to them, morning boys, how's the water? And the two young fish swim on for a bit. They don't answer him. And then one of them looks at the other and asks, what the hell is water? Actually, I think what the fish was saying is that culture is the water we swim in every day. In Spanish, we say como pez en el agua, which means feeling good, feeling in your element, feeling in an environment that feels natural and comfortable and invisible. So important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about because we're part of it. So we could ask about culture and context to our clients, but we need to know what to ask that is relevant to systems work. What parts of culture matter in our clinical work with families. So the challenge is how to make culture and power visible, but it may be an awareness of what is hidden in plain sight, but it's not easy. So how do we as therapists meet the challenge of seeing clients as their own sociocultural experts and at the same time becoming self-reflective about our own power and culture? I will give you my thinking on this challenge that for me started with Bateson's idea about information, because he said information is a difference that makes a difference. So Bateson's idea was that in order to reflect on differences, the differences needed to be named. So what cultural and context differences can we name that make a difference in the encounter between clients and practitioners? Well, I came up with 4 domains that I think are almost universal sociocultural parameters in which difference can emerge in conversations with the family. The contents of each domain will depend on what each family member answers, but I will give you suggestions of areas to have in mind when interacting with clients, like in this one. So, like if you go to migration and dislocations, there are a number of things that you can explore, like from immigration status, language proficiency, what kinds of systemic violences the family has endured, what cultural identities they have today, what social supports they had in their ecological context, past or present. I'm not going to read all of this, but it's a lot to absorb, and I do not plan to go over this in great detail, but I will illustrate some of it later. What is important for us right now is that the left-hand side, if you look at the yellow column in the migration and ecological context, that's where sociopolitical inequality tends to manifest itself more frequently. While on the right-hand side, if you look at the yellow vertical column, that's where cultural diversity becomes more salient. That has to do with worldviews, with values, with cosmologies. So you ask me, why not just let therapists discover issues as they know the family? Of course, that is what happens in practice. This is not, Mecca is not a pre-therapy assessment like a test. But there are important conversational contents that the family does not know you're interested in. For example, sometimes we ask, how many children are in the family? And they say 3. But later, we found out that they did not tell us about 3 more that they had to leave in their country. And they may not think that the separation could be connected to the misbehavior of the child that you're seeing in therapy, or the alcoholism of the father, or the depression of the mother. So Mecca involves encompasses and involves cultural diversity and sociopolitical differences. And it does have clinical practices for each one of these areas of attention. And they do require different practice in the clinical situation, but these are often conflated. And I believe that they have some things that we can learn at the level of clinical practice. So in the case of Ricky, the case required both types of clinical practice. So it required that we honor the local knowledge of the great aunt, that we empowered her to have a voice in the care of her child, that we could advocate for her, that we could address the oppressive practices of blaming her as the victim. On the cultural diversity side, we have to really be aware that we're using a theory of attachment based on the mother-child biological tie as being the only way to raise children, rather than having multiple attachments to multiple family members that raise them. And so Ricky's death was most likely inevitable. And in some ways, I think that it relates to the fact that I still think about the case. Since his heart issue could not really be resolved surgically, but much anguish and suffering could have been spared the great aunt if her cultural and personal strengths would have been recognized and honored with respect from the beginning. So then we could ask, when is a good time to introduce mega issues of culture and sociopolitical location in the therapy situation? Well, my answer is it depends. In the case of the consultation where there are obvious cultural and sociopolitical misunderstanding, you have to address them both from the go. But usually people do not come to therapy introducing culture and sociopolitical inequality as the presenting issue. In most cases, I think our moral imperative is to attend to the presenting problem first, to understand why clients are seeking services, what they hope to accomplish. And we should not start by asking about culture and social context, because clients may not think it to be relevant, or they might even feel that you're stereotyping them right away, that you're saying, oh, you're different, so tell me about it. But sociocultural issues may be relevant to their concern, that are relevant to their concern may become visible over time. So I explored Mecca after the initial session by using Mecca maps. What are Mecca maps? Where there are resources for exploring the four sociocultural domains and their meaning for clients. So clients become the meaning experts in this four areas. But we have them also as tools for sociocultural conversations. So I feel each area with answers to the questions I've asked, or things that the clients have said spontaneously. So once I first hear the concerns that clients have, then I ask what the sources of strengths they perceive. Once we agree on a tentative therapy plan, then I may use Mecca to explore culture and context issues and how this may relate to the presenting. So would the eating disorder of adolescent be tied to her migration stress and the new adaptations for her and the family? Could the misbehavior of a boy of color be tied to discrimination in his primary school? In practice, I use this, because it's already in my head, so I can go over all this very fast. But you can use this list of dimensions for your practice or for your training, or for training purposes or teaching purposes, or you may prefer a simple version that simply gives you an idea of what's involved in these four domains. So it looks very overwhelming to see when you see this diagrams, and probably more even when I show you a case in which I fill that by typing. But in fact, in in real life, not in PowerPoint, Mecca maps may look like this for therapists. Really, it's not difficult once you do it a couple of times. Or if you prefer, there are programs, for instance, there's a program that sent me some of their ways of using Mecca that use it this way as a conversation tool with a family, or even as an intake sheet that they fill out in different ways. So Mecca, and this is a very important distinction for training is about knowing with, is about learning with, rather than knowing about. It is a shared learning. So it's an important distinction in that trainees do not learn a set of traits about clients or communities of color, but rather they have dimensions to explore. The content comes about with the details of each case. And there are different ways to bring Mecca into the conversation. It could be as information gathering, as getting to know you a little bit further. With family collaboration, children many times love to participate. If you get a large paper on a wall or in Blackboard, or nowadays in the whiteboard in Zoom. So, or you can just simply use it with your notes in the map during the session, or you can add notes after the session. So Supervision recently working with a Nigerian immigrant client said to me, well, why can't I ask my client to fill out her own Mecca as we talk? And yes, you can. And some people use it. So now let me talk about how we can use Mecca for cultural humility, for practitioner self-reflection. Remember, the C in Mecca stands for comparison. So it means we use the same domains for all family members and for the therapist. That, for instance, I don't know if we will have time today, but certainly you could use the same Mecca domains for intercultural couples, where you could do he, she in each one of these and do something that is a true comparison of relational domains. And for therapists, it can be used as cultural self-study. So, and discover zones of comparing cultures and sociopolitical contexts with families, and you can discover zones of overlap or similarities, like I have done in the case of Ricky, to show you that we could have cultural borderlands. Again, it does not have to be elaborate or neat. Trainees bring some of these like this, for example, where they put themselves as therapists and besides the genogram, they make a map and then the self-reflections of the therapist in the same domains. So the comparison in the make a map can make you become more conscious about our negative or distant feelings towards some of our clients or some of our supervisees, or about some preferences and alliances toward individual family members. So once you made a comparison, so what do you do? So you may ask me, so how much do you share this with your clients? How much do you tell them that you are comparing yourself in the same domains? Well, it depends. It depends on the way you work with families, what seems to fit with their clinical needs. How much self-disclosure could be useful for alliance building, for clarifying values, for leveling or preserving hierarchies, how it relates to your use of self and in your work. So, you know, if you read Didi Watts Jones or Ken Hardy or Harriet Ponte, you will see that they have different versions of this revealing about who they are in the process. So there is a lot of cultural and sociopolitical information in each meta domain. Learning this information could help to inquire about culture and context for clients, and also be applied to the sociocultural self-study of the therapist. Well, how does this information come about? In my case, a lot of it is practice-based, because I have seen a lot of families, minorities, or people of color in my practice. And I also read quite a bit of research, things like the migration studies field has a lot of information. So I will be able to only give you a superficial idea of the contents to explore for each domain. So let's take the first domain, migration, uprooting, or dislocations. Why have I moved from just calling it migration and acculturation? I think in part is because the idea of uprootings and dislocations can apply to other circumstances and to other injustices towards people of color. For example, incarceration, detention, deportation. They are not self-determined in the same way that migration, voluntary, particularly migrations are. So it is a dynamic and constantly transforming situation. And Mecca training provides a lot of possible areas to think about, to have in mind, or to explore. And so I often get requests for interview questions for people to learn to bring Mecca into the practice room. I have resisted this request because I did not want to have it to be mechanical, like now we're going to ask about family separations and reunifications this way, or we're going to talk about immigration status or about traumatic experience in some predetermined way. But I understand now that the questions are help in thinking, in actually learning to think culturally and sociopolitically about clients and about the self-narratives of the practitioner. So I have made some of those available as ways of thinking rather than as interview schedules. So just let me give you a brief example. So possible interview questions for the Mecca domain migration and for pre-migration. So some of the questions, so when and why did you think about coming to this country? What was your motivation? Who had the idea for migrating? How many family members came with you? What were your hopes when you thought of coming? Did you know anybody that had already come? How did all family members feel about the migration decision? And then you can go on with other questions. So feel free to ask me to send you these questions if you're interested in. So, and I will tell you some as we go along. But when somebody leaves, someone stays behind. And that has become something very important to understand when it comes to the migration domain. Because separation is at the core of migration, not the core of other problems related primarily to poverty. So it used to be that immigrants, myself included, felt this emptiness or soul ache, the nostalgia for home and people. Many times people lived with a broken heart of complete disconnection with their families of origin forever. Nevertheless, immigrants today are transnationals that can have a more ambiguous experience than when communications were expensive and cumbersome. Immigrants now can live with two hearts, one here and another one trying to communicate back home. And so this is an important point in the sense that every time that I present to an audience in person, there would be a few people who say, oh, I live with two hearts. And I remember in one situation where somebody got up, I think it was in Canada, and it was a woman from Bangladesh who got up and said, you're talking about me. You're talking about me. I live with two hearts. So, but separations and reunifications have never become more harrowing than the tensions and separations of families at the border. We witnessed recently an unprecedented inhumane government policy of forcible separation of families, of which we have not yet at all seen the full consequences in mental health settings. Well, we should do as much as we can at the public level. Most of us really cannot have access to the separated families, but perhaps we can learn something useful from past work with family separations and reunifications. I call this work transnational families. And let me start the sort of a longer discussion about separations and reunifications by showing you what transnational therapists are based on. So let me show you a little video. I hope you can hear it all right.
Siempre soñamos en estar en Estados Unidos. La mayoría de los niños olvidan en lo que ya desde que crecen ya traen eso. En realidad mi mamá es muy pobre, ¿me entiendes? Y apenas el dinero que hace apenas lo usa para comer nosotros. Y o sea, yo lo que a mí me gustaría en mi vida es por ayudarle a ella para poder comprar una casa. Chico. Mami, aquí estoy en Arriaga, mamá. ¿En Arriaga? Sí. En México. Entonces estoy llamando de celular prestado. Aquí anda. No. ¿Qué estás haciendo? No, aquí estoy ahorita en Arriaga nada más esperando el tren. Ten cuidado que te mantengas en el tren. Bueno, muchas gracias. Repito, enemigos nos estamos creando en el mismo pueblo. Vamos con ellos. Ya por la pensada rápido. Yo digo, Fito, vámonos demorados. Y él digo, sí, ¿verdad? Mira, no le digo a la mamá. ¿No le dijiste a tu mamá? No. Me he ido. De París. Con el marido.
So, Kevin managed to show love and get love via borrow cell phone when he's migrating on the top of a train with his best friend from the smallest birthplace in Honduras via Mexico to his impossible dream of a better life in the US. He, of course, in La Bestia, a train that carries extreme dangers for most immigrants, for all immigrants. So, but what I want to mention too is that Stephen and Kevin share similar ecological niche and intersectionality. They share many things. They could be twins. Kevin migrates to help his mother out of poverty. His devotion to her is cultural and personal, and as it is his love, her love for him. So Nico may be escaping a more complicated family situation, which must also have cultural context and personal aspects. So technology is not sufficient to connect. Motivation matters. Nuanced conversations matter. Multiple perspectives and meanings of the same issues matter. This is why I asked, I do not assume guidance. So, but the reason I wanted to show you this is in part to see that cell phones are very readily available, even from a boy that is incredibly poor, and he borrows a phone to talk to his mother. And cell phones offer connection in the midst of separation and suffering, and they can be resilient possibilities for repair or relational ruptures. So even the narrowing passage through the desert has become more digital. Smugglers alert immigrants of dangers ahead by texting them to watch out or take cover in the bushes. So coyotes have become cyber coyotes using cell phones. And so I believe that practitioners can also make use of technologies of communications, FaceTime, email, to facilitate connection between separated family members. So we need to think transnationally to be curious about the two worlds of the clients, the here and the there. So, let me illustrate a case of the Filipino children reunited with mother in San Diego after 4 years of separation, to which I'm going to apply Mecca so that we could have an actual clinical illustration. So I obtained a lot of sociocultural information through Mecca after I had seen the family for a couple of times. And what stand out? is a primary separation in the migration domain of 4 years of minimal contact between the mother and the between the mother and the children who were being raised by the grandmother, who now is separated from her own adult sons by coming to accompany the children to meet the mother. So in ecological context, what stands out is the diagnosis of hyperactivity and mother wondering about teacher possible discrimination of the boy. The boy says the teacher is on his case more than he is on other children. In family life cycle stands out that Fernando is very controlling of his mother's behavior, and the children are rebellious and critical of the mother. And in family organization, what stands out is the lack of parental role clarity. So I'm going to now let's look at myself by comparing in bottom quadrants in each domain what I have said about me, the therapist. I learned from the personal exercise actually that my cultural borderlines were substantial, at the personal level. Remember, I'm comparing myself at the personal level and at the professional level. I migrated as a young woman, as a couple alone with my husband, no family, no community, many separations, far away. Argentina is probably not as far away as the Philippines, but quite far, with new cultural values and language. And then I have considerable expertise in the professional level on working with immigrants. So the level of ecological context, I could say, understand social isolation. I could go a lot more describing who I am. I'm not going to, but I am the first person in my family to have education, my nuclear family, because I was the first one born in Argentina of immigrant parents. And the first one, then the first generation to go to school and having to prove myself as an immigrant in this country. So then on the family life cycle level, I also raised children. I've been a single mother by widowhood, as you see in family organization. And I have raised children also in strict ways, but not with physical discipline, like the mother was suggesting to use with Fernando's unruliness. So I'm just going to mention here that migration relational stress takes many forms. I have only mentioned here, and I will mention only separations and unifications, but there are others. So migration relational stress is, I just wanted to give you an idea about it. But let me tell you a little bit more about the feminization of migration that I think is very relevant to the case that I just undertook. So for a long time, women now have been coming along from Mexico, Central America, and the Philippines, being the countries of men out women migration. You may have seen this picture in the front page of the New York Times in 2005. Most women come to better their children's lives, escaping poverty and violence. But sometimes there's psychological costs for the family. And so I have developed some ideas for clinical practices to use during separation and during unification. So what are these practices? They already have shown you this diagram. And so I took on the first one, migration, by asking, what was their contact during the separation? Mother said it was minimal. And then I asked, why was it minimal? She answered that she was busy working and studying. She became a dental hygienist. And so she was, for 4 years, she was studying. But if she called them, the time difference of 16 hours made it very, very difficult, but which the family kind of balked at, saying, well, it's not so difficult. But then she said something that apparently she had not shared enough, that she could not stop crying for days, and that she wanted to protect them from her crying and from them feeling the same way she did. Of course, this is not what the children and their grandmother thought. The meaning for them was one of abandonment and for total freedom on her part. So her feelings to some extent, and the fact that I validated them, were new information. So an observation made by research and clinical experience is that most immigrant parents that separate from their children do not know that communications and expression of emotions make a significant difference. And many respond like Mariana did, that they did not want to make the children upset. In fact, some leave in the middle of the night without telling their children that they're not going to see the parents anymore for a very long time. They do. So if Mariana had been in therapy during these 4 years, I probably would have encouraged her to maintain connections. Because the situation for separations due to migrations are not dissimilar to kinship foster care. The mother is encouraged to be the proactive person that initiates the connection via phone calls, letters, remittances, email, in some regular ritualized way. And perhaps if the person is not able to, like the mother was telling us how she could not stop crying, perhaps it could have happened during or outside the therapy by working with her about this. Another similarity with foster care is the importance of a positive relationship between the biological mother, the caretaker, and the child too. So like what we could call a positive triangle. And so, and there are many examples of parenting from afar that are useful to know about. So for instance, I will show you another little video of a very resilient father who found.
¿No quieres eso? Ok.
No.
¿Ven? Piénsalo bien, ahorita va a estar tiempo de arrepentirse. Ayer te estoy hablando con tu para la casa. ¿Con cuánto pasaste tu grado?
8.6.
Sí. Oh, estás muy bajita, ¿no? ¿Tú sabes cuánto ya no tengo de este?
Madre,
¿Sabes cuánto ya no tengo de este?
Juanita.
Como de aquí hasta donde estás. Y esto me va a contar la llamada, amiga. Yo más tarde les hablo.
Está bien.
¿Sí?
Está bien.
Mira tu mamá que yo le hablo como a las 3 de la tarde.
Está bien.
¿Ah?
Está bien, no te lo digo.
Dale, pues, mija, ahí te cuida y vístase bien chula, ¿eh? Porque después la quiero mucho.
Está bien.
Dale. Cuídense bien. Cuídense también a todos los que están ahí.
Bien.
Y a tu mami otro beso más grande. Dile que la quiero mucho.
I always wait for that big smile. That's such an incredible, sweet smile that she has. She's very happy to have talked to her. So the video actually starts with the girl who's the oldest of 3 children fighting with her siblings. And so the father is teaching her to control herself at long distance and not fight with her siblings. He praises her about her grades with humor. 10 is the maximum in Mexico grading system, but she gets 8.6, and he teases her that that must be too little. Then he talks to her about the dresses that the mother will buy with the remittances that he's sending. He tells her how much he loves her, and also tells her how much he loves her mother. And later on, he calls and romantically sings to his wife her favorite song. So clearly this connection is as much to comfort the father for the distance as to parent the daughter. He probably is suffering from somebody who wrote a paper in Ecuador called digital nostalgia. So, and there are things to learn about what to do during separation of parents and children in migration. And then there's also things related to exploring what to do during unifications. And during unification, making meaning out of the separation and how it was handled is very important. And restoring a strengths-based family story, restore family role clarity, explore the trauma of abandonment pre, during, or post-migration, and acknowledge fears of separations. It is also helpful to know if the mother or father have approval for the decision to migrate without the children. So I didn't know at this point, when it came to Fernando, how much his anxiety had anything to do with acknowledging that he didn't know whether his mother was going to separate from them again or not. So, and there are also specialized practices for unifications, like catching up life narratives, celebrations of the reunification, honoring the caretaker, which certainly had not happened here, and narrative certificates of legitimization of the mother and father's right to parent in spite of the absence. What I mean by that is that separated family members can share events of their lives during separation, catching up with each other, and therapy also may decide to extend a certificate of legitimization at some point. That is a sociopolitical reference to a period of parental absence as forced and not implying an absence of love. So then we can go to the ecological context and see what happens in relation to this family in terms of community, work, school, religion. And we can, if we were in training with Mecca, we could deconstruct a lot more what we mean by under neighborhood or under work or under school. So this is actually not that dissimilar to economics and what social workers do. So let's look at our case again. Let's go back to them in terms of ecological context. The mother was not wrong about suspecting discrimination in the school, but I think what she meant is the fact that there was no exploration of any sort about immigration issues. Many teachers assume that children live permanently with their parents. The diagnosis of ADHD was formulaic and not incorporating possible effects of culture and family change in Fernando, an immigrant child. Schools need to become more culturally aware and sensitive to the complexities of immigrant children. But even Fernando's family did not think his hyperactivity was perhaps anxiety tied to being an immigrant or to his fears of separation when the war was going on. So we need to listen with a wider ear to begin these conversations, to tap the effects of social inequality, to try to reach some form of equity. Because clients do not usually come to therapy to speak about their ethnic beliefs, their race, their class, or their gender inequality, but they're presenting problems of anxiety, depression, somatic pain, substance abuse, or anger, self-esteem issues may be the response to ecological stressors. So we need to listen with a wider ear. And what I mean by that is that we need to listen and honor openings about sociopolitical stressors that could take the form of, how it is for people like us. It's not surprising that the daycare did not want to help us, or I did not think she could really be serious about me. This is a Black woman talking about a white woman being interested in her. And American bosses is white as Mexican. So family therapy has a long history of studying the micro level of language communications between clients and therapists. But it's much easier, of course, to hear if you can audio tape or videotape sessions for your own use and for supervision, because then when you have a replay, you hear for the first time perhaps something that was said, but you didn't capture it at the moment. Actually, the psychoanalyst Theodor Reich in 1948 wrote a book called Listening with the Third Ear about perceiving the deeper meanings or the emotional underpinnings conveyed when somebody's speaking to you. So in our example, Mariana, the mother, says at some point, I don't sleep around like what white women do. So then I had heard, and I had put in the Mecca diagram that a little bit something that had been forming in my head in terms of what the children and grandmothers were criticizing Mariana for. Had she become more Americanized in some ways when they were criticizing US values and were criticizing mother going out with friends. And I also thought at the time that perhaps Fernando was a spokesperson for traditional women's modesty coming from the grandmother or from the father that had remained in the Philippines. Or maybe he meant it because he had heard that the mother and the grandmother saying that Janine should not be exposed to the new sexual behavior or values in this country. So, and it occurred to me at the moment that if one starts to think about gender oppression, could this be a form of gender oppression from the culture to the woman, to the young woman, relatively young woman that Mariana was? Why could she not be free to go out with her friends or with men? But then when I heard Mariana saying, I don't sleep around like white women do, I wonder, what was she telling us? I asked her what she meant. And she said, I do not know why they don't trust me. Just because I did not call them enough, they thought I was sleeping around. I want them to know that I have not changed. I have kept my values. So she was actually, on this sentence, she was speaking to the family, to her mother. Perhaps she was speaking to me too, I don't know, and to her children, but also to the American culture. She was creating actually a resistant counter narrative to being seen as transformed by American values, instead of being seen as still valuing the strengths of her culture and her Catholic religion. So we have been talking a lot about moving from the public to the personal, but we can also sometimes, like in this situation, move from the private and personal to the cultural and public. That was important to understand. And I only understood it as I became more interested in Filipino history and culture. That is important as many Filipinos do not want to be colonized again by the United States, who occupied it for many decades. And women were used sexually during the very long occupation. So the issue of counter narrative sometimes comes up in a very passing sentence where it says, I am not this way. And I don't want to be this way. So it is actually more frequent and important than we have reflected on. So, for example, there are women that I see in the public clinic, in the clinic for under-resourced immigrants, that will be upset when the teachers have said that they don't help the children enough with school. And they say, no, we cannot help them with math or with literature, but we do educate them because we create an education and home about honesty, for example. So listening to what people say that taps their inequality is and their maintenance of cultural values is very important. So let's look at the next at the Mecca domain of family organization, and it's probably one that you're familiar with as family therapist. How is your client family organized? Is it a nuclear family? Is it a extended family, 2 or 3 generational family? What are the generation? Well, are they both egalitarian or are they patriarchal? So what I want to say about family organization in Mecca is that we should pay a lot of attention to grandmothers. The grandmothers are often other mothers. They may be the own mothers, the caregivers. They are integral to the lives and communities, the lives of communities of color, children and youth. We need to study grandchild-grandparent relationships and inquire about them in therapy. We need to legitimize, perhaps, grandmothers as primary caretakers. In the current immigration crisis, children that arrive at the border with their grandmothers have been often classified as unaccompanied minors and not returned to the caretakers because they were not a parent or not a legal. So inquiring about extended family at short or long distance may be a resource or a cause of worry or tension. I don't want to say to you that I idealize extended families because they may have their own problems. They may have overstressed systems of cares. They may do criticism, gossips, favoritism, envy, jealousy, favors asked and not returned. So, but it is important for us to ask about extended family and the quality of the involvement. The meanings of this contents will be given by our clients. We should not idealize or denigrate these relationships at all. But what we do need to know as therapists is that to have self-reflection about the models and the values that we use with family organization. If you look at the left-hand side, you will see that when it comes to parenthood, individual attention control, kin network, and problems, we do tend to favor and sometimes impose the values and the worldviews of small families, as parenthood needing to be intensive, high, democratic, and to exclude the comments of the network and problems to be magnified rather than minimized, like it happens in very large families. And so we need to learn more about the strengths and vulnerabilities of large families. So, and then the Mecca domain of the life cycle, what I would like to say about that is that, again, we need to understand cultural diversity in the life cycle because the duration of stages may be different, the timing and meaning of the transitions may be different, the developmental task of age groups. Many people believe that many therapists actually and teachers believe that children may be overprotected in Latino families or even in Black families, or they may be raised with a lot of discipline without really understanding the diversity that comes both from the culture and the sociopolitical location. So let me just mention one that is very common and that those of you who work with immigrants are probably aware of value conflicts between life cycle models within the family. And so in many cases, the issues here have been seen as the grandparents or the parents as the therapists have focused on the C, means cultural value differences, which points to the parents have been somewhat rigid and the authoritarian approach to the children and the adolescents, and old-fashioned parents who do not understand modern society. Well, I believe that cultural value differences may enter in terms of family organization and family life cycle, but that we do need to pay attention to ecological fears that are very high among all immigrants, but particularly for the unauthorized. And at the level of affect, we should also think how difficult it is for parents with no family around who have already left a lot of family to also let go of their children to other places. So many immigrants suffer separation anxiety on themselves. So we can develop empathy for the parents and not just for the youth. So you can use this idea of SEFSA to build bridges between parents and adolescents, to clarify different cultural family expectations, to reframe the parents' behavior as ecological fear and separation anxiety, and to encourage compromise or even biculturalism on areas that are out of sync. So Mecca is applicable too many to in therapy, to training and to supervision, to most cultural and sociocultural groups. So let me just say that in supervision, people are often at a loss that despite changes, it's still the case that most supervisors of color are being supervised by white supervisors that are thought to not have a culture and that are comfortable and not have a culture. They have the mainstream culture that becomes the standard, and they're comfortable in their power position. So supervisors can become more comfortable with cultural discussions if they have a few guidelines for exploration of cultural context for themselves, if they can model their own culture and context self-awareness, and they could begin to examine their own. So if there is supervisors that are open to discuss culture, the supervisors are more likely to be more open to initiating similar discussions with clients. That means supervision as a form of co-vision, where the cultures can all be there, the one of the therapist, the supervisor, and the family. So I've always learned from the people who approach me, and not very long ago, somebody sent me this that could be very useful. An increased use of computer notes or Zoom meetings. Some people prefer to fill Mecca maps in the computer. Here are some modules that are, so it could be for the family, for the client's map, or the therapist map. You can use a separate map for yourself or use one double for comparison like this, like I've done with the previous Mecca maps. Or you can, the supervisor could also see what you've written for the family, for yourself, and then write for themselves. So let me just mention something that I has been a cause of concern, or at least of thinking on my part, that we have all become very supportive and of a very, very important movement, the DEI movement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I agree that this is necessary for many, many organizations, but I tell you what my concern is, that DEI efforts stand for including in our services people who are not like us and have less access to resources. But inclusion poses a problem. It implies that our structures and our theories can stay the same, only making more room for minority people, or for underserved people, or for people of color. So, but we need to look at our services with the double consciousness, and instead of holding on to them as being only the right ones, become open to new possibilities that may be better suited for our clients. In Ricky's case, what was wrong with giving the child food he was used to, or having the great aunt pray in front of him, or him being raised by a great aunt? Was Mariana oppressed by sexual mores? Or are we asking people to comply with our definitions of how treatment should be? The concept of stigma is very prevalent. And is it a correct observation, or is it a form of cultural resistance to the standard values and parameters, the 15-minute hour, the private space, the hour of convenience with the therapist, the fee for not showing up? So our professional theories are cultures of healing based on constructions and values embedded in our dominant ideologies. For example, attachment based on the biological mother-child bond as the only primary one. Concepts such as individuation, differentiation of self, boundaries, reaction information, enabling, may be cultural constructions that do not apply to other cultures or sociopolitical locations. Or even concepts like acculturation or assimilation need not be taken for granted. So my idea is that perhaps it should be DET, diversity, equity, and transformation, that culturally safe care needs to be defined by clients and communities. And unless inclusion means including DET, including, means including other perspectives, but it could then be acceptable. But as long as we're not able to really modify our structures, I believe that transformation is necessary. So let me just finish with a saying that in terms of Mecca, that the map is not the territory. That is being usually attributed to Bateson, but actually it isn't. Bateson just said complex territories can be better navigated with maps. And that's what I have attempted to do by having Mecca map. But it is difficult to hold to both ideas. Don't forget about culture and context, but treat each person as an individual. So I've always liked very much for several years now, something that the African-American poet Parker said, if you want to be my friend, the first thing you do is to forget that I'm mine. The second thing is that you must never forget that. So I think we are close to the half hour that I'm going to have with the audience. So maybe this is a good time to now stop. Okay. So can you hear me, Marlene?
I hear you. Yes. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I do.
Well, thank you, Celia, for this really stellar presentation and thought-provoking presentation. I really find myself reflecting on the DET because I think that you've made the case that it's not just including others into the existing structure, but what we need to do, you know, to expand and to be able to effectively work with various cultures is to be more accepting and understanding of those various cultures.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlene.
Okay, one of the first questions that was asked earlier is whether or not your slides will be available to participants. Will they be, or will it be that they can go back and review the recording and see the slides in the recording?
They can view the recording, and if somebody is interested in the slides, they can email me. The email is in the first slide.
Okay. Now, if you like, we can also send them out to the registrants for you if you want to send them to us.
If there's interest, I will take out some things like the videos.
Okay. All right. That sounds fine. So then for anyone who would like the slide, please email Celia directly and she can send you the slide. Any other questions for Dr. Falicov?
Yes.
Sierra, is it possible for you to put the email into the chat?
Yes, will do.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or any comments or points of clarification? Okay, let's see. Not a question, but a bravo to you, Celia, for sharing your comprehensive, complex thinking and Mecca schema. Many thanks from an old, that's a pun, friend. Fred G.
Okay. So should I ask some questions myself?
That's up to you. That'll be fine. We have folks who are in the chat saying how informative and useful the information that you presented is. Let's see, I think we have another. Is there more in-depth training on Mecca? Perhaps a slower pace?
Well, usually, yes. Usually I have more than an hour and a half. to give a webinar or a workshop. Yes, there are, and certainly I have writings on Mecca, and the book Latino Families in Therapy has many chapters with cases, including Mecca maps that are applicable to other groups and not only Latinx groups.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Ciara, would you check the chat for any questions that may have been put there? And we have one question. Do you have any recommendations for resources to look at mental relational health from more collectivistic cultures or frameworks?
No, unfortunately, nothing comes to mind because there's, to some extent, there is sort of a cultural colonization in the world of family therapy too. So where people utilize things produced in the United States. There is, the oldest, in sociology, I would say that if you turn to sociology, there are some some work done on large family systems. So sociology and anthropology are much better than psychology in these issues.
Okay, thank you. We do not see any questions in the chat. We've reviewed the chat. So if there's anyone who has a question, please put it in the Q&A. I see one question now, I think. Have you ever presented these ideas in a psychiatry hospital that work with DSM diagnostic models? How do you dialogue with psychiatric sector?
Well, it's not easy, but I can tell you something that I've been doing recently that may be of interest to you. Because I work in a medical setting in the clinic for underserved, under-resourced immigrants, the medical students are part of that clinic. And there's quite a large number of family medicine students who are interested in psychiatry. And so I developed something called the fireside chats, in which medical students meet with psychologists to discuss the intersection with culture and social context in the lives of their clients, both in health and mental health. So our hope is that the new generations of psychiatrists who are also still learning the DSM-5, who has more of an interest, and you probably are aware of the cultural formulation interview in psychiatry, where these ideas are beginning to be part of psychiatry. In fact, I just remember that now at the end of April, I will be presenting at the Society for Psychiatry and Culture that is meeting in San Diego. And that's a group of psychiatrists that are very interested in culture and social justice.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. How do you address cultural values that conflict with personal and professional values? For example, I worked with a family that identified as Black, whose parents valued the discipline technique of whipping their children with a belt.
Well, so if I understand the question correctly, I would, so it's, do I understand that what you're saying is that the family favors these approaches to discipline and the therapist disagrees, right? So if we go back to what I just presented at the very end of my presentation about ecological fears, about SEFSA, right? I mean, like if you want to, I'll go back to that slide, but basically, or the fears that parents may have about the environment. It is not just a cultural difference that parents prefer this way. I'm not sure they prefer this way, but that they feel this way is a necessity. And so because their children are constantly exposed to systemic violence in the streets, in their interaction in institutions with the, with the police. And so I would want to explore what is the meaning of this type of strict discipline for the parents? Could it be seen as protective? Could it be seen as a way of raising children away from danger? So, so I would have to find out what kinds of things are being reprimanded for in the children, and whether the general ideology, say, of parenting fits with other issues that don't have to do with cultural diversity, but it has to do also with inequality.
Thank you.
Let's see, somebody suggesting a book.
Well, my grandmother's hands, they're suggesting is aligned with what you said, you know, in terms of spanking children and fear, you know, and it being seen as protective. I mean, that extends all the way back in terms of Black families and why they did it, you know, it was seen as protective.
Yes, because if you are in your best behavior all the time and don't confront anybody, or don't, you try to then avoid the possibility of danger.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask people if there are one or two takeaways from this presentation that could be useful for your therapy, or for your teaching, or for your supervision. I see the takeaways, Mecca.
Mecca is a takeaway for one participant. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not sure if the person who's asking this question was on, these recordings are posted on Acumen's YouTube channel. And I'm not sure if you're able to read the chat, but one person is saying, I think the topic is so vast that having a system that you laid out is so helpful. Thank you. Your comment about the issue with inclusion was very meaningful. To live with two hearts, holding space for a mosaic of identities. So quite a number of takeaways. There are quite a few to be taken away from this presentation. Double consciousness is another for someone. I think it can be useful also for us here in the Caribbean. I appreciated your description of DET and the diagram of the therapist's self-reflection about their models and values about family organization. Takeaway is to keep individual spirituality and family dynamic role in therapy assessment. Yes. I think we're getting to where everything you said was critical and could be easily a takeaway, used easily as a takeaway to work with our clients. As a Jewish Latina psychologist with family from Argentina and always working with the Latinx population, I resonated with most of your lecture. And then we have someone who's asking, can you say a little more about cultural humility, how to invite that exploration into the clinical space?
Well, the way that I have tried is by using the same dimensions of Mecca. So I had something to compare myself with, or the therapist with. So I think that cultural humility, sometimes it could just mean a reflection that you're not always right, that it's possible that you need to ask more, I mentioned the idea of names. I actually like very much the idea of introducing oneself as with one's name, and that names carry a lot of meaning. So, for example, you should not assume that somebody, so I want to tell you a case very, very briefly, okay? Because it's one that when your question made me think about this. There was a little boy, a 9-year-old boy that I saw with his family, that his name was Jesus, Jesus in Spanish, right? So, but when we introduced each other in the session, he says, I asked him, what is your name? He said, it's Jesus, but call me Tommy. And so he immediately told me he did not want to be called his given name. So I immediately assumed, or maybe I did not immediately assume actually, because I had some cultural humility at that point. And I said to him, well, tell me at some point, I said, tell me more. Why do you want to be called Tommy? And he said, well, Jesus is dumb. It's a dumb name. So immediately I thought, oh, he means dumb Mex because he was Mexican. So that he was afraid of being stereotyped that way. But I could have, with cultural humility, I could have thought about other things. And I did at the moment too. So could Jesus be a way of not being thought of different and too strange? Could it be that the family was very religious and spiritual, and for him it meant that it was a sacred name? Could it mean that the teacher was constantly saying to him that he was making bad decisions because he wasn't doing this or that right? So did he think that his parents had made a bad decision in putting a name like Jesus on him? So it had multiple meanings. And I think one of the ways in which you could exercise cultural humility right away, without Mecca even, is to say, am I right in what I'm thinking? Did I immediately think that he wanted to get away from dumb Mex? What other meanings could it be? There was that, but there were other meanings. And so that's the first thing you need to do with cultural humility. Don't think that you have the right answer or the diagnosis or the DSM. Okay.
We have another takeaway. This one says there were innumerable takeaways, but one that I would highlight is to increase the therapist's openness to self-inquiry.
Thank you. Okay, very good. So if you were saying, is there one thing in therapy or in supervision or in teaching that you may want to change from hearing this presentation? One thing. Cultural humility demands that we get only one thing out of a therapy hour or a seminar or a webinar, because our memories are short. So, well, maybe that was answered already.
No, let's see, did anyone, don't assume is the one thing that one person has. I think that your presentation is not only for mental health, but for education as well, talking about differences. And one for me is supervisors not sharing and reflecting on themselves as an invitation to their supervisees to do that not only with themselves, but also with their clients. I think too often supervisors don't do that.
You know, supervisors can really start the supervision by sharing names and the origins of names as a way of beginning to enter the culture.
Yes. Someone says discuss culture, but address the immediate issue first. So timing of cultural discussion is key. And then another is the knowing with, learning with clients, the co-vision.
Mhm. Okay.
Great. You have any other questions you want to pose to the participants?
Oh, there's something you wish I had addressed, but I did not.
Okay, folks, here you go. What do you wish had been addressed that wasn't? DET would be very transformational. I don't know if that's something that they wish they had more of, or if they were responding to the question before this. Responded to the question before. Does anyone have something that they wish had been included in this presentation that wasn't? What are the counter narratives that live in the silences of crossing when one leaves their homelands?
Interesting. Thank you. That's something for me to think about.
Do we have any others or any other questions or comments before we end? Thank you for the lovely presentation. I don't think we can give you enough kudos for all the information that you imparted to us in all of its complexity and the takeaways that everyone is sharing. There are many that are so useful for our practice. So I just want to, again, on behalf of the Ackerman Institute for the Family, thank you for coming and doing this presentation. Someone says very helpful and makes them a better provider. So people are thanking you. And I so very much thank you. And as I said at the beginning, you are someone that I have looked up to and admired throughout my career in the field. And I am very appreciative to all that I've learned from you, including tonight. So thank you, thank you, thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you for inviting me and for listening to me.
You're quite
So-
welcome.